The woman had stopped counting days years ago, but she knew the sound of approaching boots. Heavy, purposeful, the kind that meant someone was coming to take something from you. When the door to the comfort station splintered open on that humid afternoon in August 1945, Keiko pressed herself against the wall and waited for the inevitable. Except what happened next wasn't inevitable at all. The first American soldier through the door froze. His rifle, raised and ready, slowly lowered as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Behind him, 3 more men pushed in, then stopped as if they'd hit an invisible wall. The stench reached them first, a mixture of unwashed bodies, illness, and despair that had soaked into the wooden walls over years. Then they saw the women. There were 23 of them in that first room alone. Some sat on thin straw mats too weak to stand. Others had retreated to corners, their eyes vacant, staring at nothing. A few watched the Americans with the kind of wariness that comes from knowing exactly what men with power can do to women without it. Keiko was among the watchers. She was 24 years old, though she looked 40. Her hair, once thick and black, hung in brittle strands around a face that had forgotten how to express anything but endurance. The Americans said nothing at first. One of them, a tall man with red hair and freckles across his sunburned nose, made a small choking sound and turned away. Another, shorter and stockier, with corporal stripes on his sleeve, removed his helmet and wiped his forehead, his hand shaking slightly. "Jesus Christ," the corporal finally whispered. It wasn't blasphemy. It was prayer. The red-haired soldier stepped back outside. Through the broken doorway, Keiko could hear him retching into the grass. The others remained, seeming unsure of their next move. They had been trained for combat, for securing enemy positions, for neutralizing threats. Nobody had trained them for this. The corporal cleared his throat and tried to speak in Japanese, his accent terrible and halting. "No hit. We no hurt." He held up both hands, palms out, as if approaching frightened animals. Perhaps, in a way, he was. None of the women moved. Keiko had heard promises before. They always preceded something worse. But then one of the soldiers, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, turned and jogged back toward the main road where their unit had gathered. He returned minutes later carrying canvas bags, which he set down gently near the entrance. From them, he pulled out tins of food, packages wrapped in brown paper, and several canteens. The corporal approached slowly, knelt down a respectful distance from the nearest woman, an older woman named Fumiko who had been there longer than anyone, and placed a tin on the floor. He used a small tool to open it, revealing pale meat in thick gelatin. Then he stood up and backed away, as if giving her space to decide. Fumiko stared at the tin for a long moment. Her hand twitched but didn't reach. She had learned not to trust gifts. The young soldier opened his own canteen, took a drink himself, then placed it beside the tin. He pointed to it, to his mouth, and smiled encouragingly. It was such a strange expression, that smile. Keiko had not seen a man smile at her without cruelty behind it since before the war. Since before the truck came to her village with promises of factory work in the city. Another woman, Hannah, barely 18 but aged beyond her years, began to cry. Not the silent tears they had all perfected, but gasping sobs that shook her thin shoulders. The sound seemed to break something in the Americans. The red-haired soldier, back from his moment of sickness, approached her carefully and pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket. He held it out, and when she didn't take it, he placed it on the floor beside her and retreated. The corporal spoke again, more urgently now, and this time one of the other soldiers translated better. "We're Americans. The war, it's ending. You're safe now. We're going to help you." Safe. The word meant nothing. Keiko had not been safe since she was 16, when she'd been taken from her family's farm in Korea. That was 8 years ago, though it felt like 8 lifetimes. She had been moved from station to station, city to city, always kept in rooms that smelled like this one, always subject to the same routine brutality that the Imperial Army justified as necessary for morale. The American soldiers left the food and water and backed out of the room. Keiko watched them through the doorway as they gathered outside, speaking in urgent, agitated tones. The corporal was making gestures, pointing back toward their main column. The young one kept shaking his head as if trying to clear it of what he'd seen. Inside the room, nobody moved toward the supplies for several long minutes. Then Fumiko's hand darted out, grabbed the tin, and pulled it back against her chest. She sniffed it suspiciously, then took a tiny bite of the meat. Her eyes widened. She took another bite, then another, faster now, as if afraid someone would snatch it away. That broke the spell. Other women crawled forward, reaching for tins and canteens. Keiko stayed where she was, still watching, still waiting for the trick. But as she watched Hana drink water and cry harder because it was clean, because it was cold, because it tasted like water was supposed to taste, something inside Keiko's chest began to crack. The Americans returned with more supplies. This time, they brought blankets, medical kits, and a medic, identified by the Red Cross on his helmet. The medic spoke no Japanese at all, but he moved slowly and telegraphed every action. He pointed to cuts, to bruises, to the obvious signs of malnutrition and disease, and held up bandages and medicine bottles for approval before approaching anyone. One woman, Sachiko, had a wound on her leg that had become infected. The skin around it was angry and red, streaked with dark lines that indicated blood poisoning. The medic saw it and immediately knelt beside her, his face grave. He showed her a bottle of sulfa powder and bandages, then pointed to the wound and to the supplies. Sachiko looked at Keiko. Keiko didn't know why Sachiko looked at her. She held no authority here, no special status. Perhaps it was simply because Keiko still had enough fire in her eyes to seem capable of judgment. Keiko studied the medic's face. She had become an expert in reading men, in seeing the difference between the ones who viewed them as human and the ones who did not. This one's eyes held concern. Not lust, not contempt, concern. She nodded. The medic's shoulders relaxed slightly. He worked quickly and competently, cleaning the wound, applying powder, wrapping it in clean white gauze. When he finished, he packed up his supplies and moved to the next woman who needed attention, which was nearly all of them. Outside, more Americans had arrived. Keiko could hear engines, vehicles pulling up on the road. The corporal went out to meet them, and soon a captain appeared, a man in his 30s with tired eyes and a jaw set in grim determination. He surveyed the building, spoke briefly with his men, and then began issuing orders. The Americans set up what they called a triage station in the overgrown garden behind the building. They unloaded folding tables, more medical supplies, and containers of food from their trucks. They worked with military efficiency, but without the hardness that usually accompanied such movements. These men seemed shaken, operating on training and duty because their emotions had been temporarily overwhelmed. The captain entered the building and attempted to speak to the women. His Japanese was better than the corporal's, though still heavily accented. "I am Captain Richard Morrison of the United States Army. We are here to provide aid and protection. No one will harm you. You have my word." Words. Keiko had heard many words, but words were followed by actions, and it was actions that told the truth. So she watched. They were invited, not ordered, to come outside to the medical station. Some women refused, too afraid to leave the building despite its horror. The Americans didn't force them. Instead, they brought the supplies inside, worked in the cramped, stinking rooms, treated wounds and handed out food to those who wouldn't or couldn't leave. Keiko finally stood. Her legs shook from disuse and malnutrition, and she had to steady herself against the wall. Hana looked up at her, frightened. "Where are you going?" "Outside," Keiko said. Her voice was rough and used. She had stopped speaking months ago, when speaking had proven pointless. She walked slowly toward the door, each step an act of will. The sunlight, when she emerged into it, was blinding. She raised a hand to shield her eyes and stood there, swaying slightly as her vision adjusted. The garden had once been beautiful, she thought. Someone had planted cherry trees, though they were wild now, untended. The Americans had set up their station beneath them, and medical supplies sat on tables in dappled shade. A soldier approached her, holding out a canteen. She took it this time, her hands trembling so badly that water sloshed over the rim. She brought it to her lips and drank. The water was cool and sweet and tasted like the mountain streams from her childhood in Korea, before the occupation, before the war, before everything had been taken from her. She drank until her stomach hurt, then lowered the canteen and looked at the soldier. He was young, maybe 20, with dark hair and soft eyes. He smiled at her, that same careful, gentle smile the others had used, and said something in English she didn't understand. But his tone was kind. That much translated clearly. Keiko's vision blurred. She blinked, confused, and realized she was crying. She could not remember the last time she had cried. Tears required hope, and hope had died so long ago she'd forgotten what it felt like. But here it was, this tiny, fragile thing, painful in its rebirth, burning in her chest like a coal that had been buried in ash and suddenly found oxygen. The medic approached her next, gesturing toward one of the tables. She let herself be guided to a chair, a real chair, and sat down. He checked her eyes, her throat, listened to her heart and lungs. His hands were professional, impersonal in the way of medical examinations rather than violations. He made notes on a clipboard and showed her bottles of vitamins, gestured taking pills, eating food. She nodded to indicate understanding. More women emerged from the building, drawn by curiosity or hunger or simply the sight of Keiko sitting in sunlight, unharmed. They came slowly, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The Americans made space for them, pulled out more chairs, opened more rations. One soldier had a camera and started to raise it, then seemed to think better of it and put it away. This was not something to photograph. This was something to remember with shame. By evening, all 23 women from the first room were outside. The Americans had discovered more rooms, more women. 31 in total, ranging in age from 16 to 42. All of them bore the same marks, physical and otherwise. All of them had the same hollow eyes that had seen too much. The captain spoke to them as a group, his translator, a Nisei soldier named George Yamada, conveying his words more fluently. "We are establishing a displaced persons camp 15 miles from here. You will be taken there, given food, clothing, medical care, and shelter. From there, we will work to reunite you with your families if possible, or make other arrangements for your welfare. No one will be forced to do anything against their will. You are under American protection now." Families. Keiko hadn't thought about her family in years. The thought of them was too painful, so she had locked it away. Her mother, her father, her younger brother. Were they alive? Did they think she was dead? Did they remember her at all? Or had she become just another girl who vanished during the war, one among thousands? The women were loaded into trucks, gently, with American soldiers helping them climb up into the beds where benches had been installed. Keiko found herself sitting next to Fumiko, who clutched a tin of food she hadn't finished, as if afraid there would be no more. Keiko understood. Trust would take more than an afternoon to rebuild. The truck rumbled to life and began moving. Keiko watched the comfort station recede through the open back. It had been her prison for 2 years, one of several. She had survived it, but barely, and mostly by making herself into something less than human, something that could endure without breaking completely. Now, watching it disappear, she wondered if she could become human again. If any of them could. The displaced persons camp was a collection of large tents surrounded by sandbags and barbed wire, but the wire was for keeping threats out, not for keeping them in. Inside, there were cots with clean sheets, latrines that were regularly maintained, and a mess tent where food was served on actual plates. The women were given soap, shampoo, toothbrushes, towels, and changes of clothing, surplus military uniforms that had to be rolled at the cuffs and cinched at the waist but were clean and whole. Keiko stood under a shower for 20 minutes, letting hot water pour over her, washing away layers of grime and memory. Not all memories could be washed away, she knew. Some had sunk too deep, stained too dark. But at least she could be clean on the surface. That night, lying on a cot in a tent with 9 other women, Keiko stared at the canvas ceiling and listened to the sounds around her. Someone was crying quietly. Someone else was snoring. Outside, she could hear American soldiers talking in low voices, the sound of a radio playing music, normal sounds of a military camp at night. "Hannah," on the cot next to hers, whispered, "Do you think they're telling the truth? About helping us find our families?" Keiko didn't know. She wanted to believe it, but belief was dangerous. "I think they believe it," she said finally. "Whether they can do it is another question." "My parents were in Seoul," Hannah said, "before the war. I don't even know if Seoul still exists." "It exists," Keiko said. "Cities were hard to kill. Whether your parents are still there, I can't say." Silence stretched between them. Then Hannah asked, "What will you do if they can't find your family?" Keiko had no answer. She had not allowed herself to think past survival for so long that the concept of a future was abstract. What did people do in peacetime? What did women do when they were no longer being used as objects for men's gratification? She had been 16 when she was taken. She barely remembered being anything other than what the war had made her. Over the following days, patterns emerged. The Americans brought in doctors, real doctors with proper equipment. They brought in social workers, translators, and officials from various relief organizations. Each woman was interviewed, her information recorded, inquiries sent out to try to locate surviving family members. Keiko's interview was conducted by George Yamada and a woman from the Red Cross named Helen Carter. Mrs. Carter was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that radiated competent compassion. She asked questions without judgment, recorded answers without visible reaction, and treated each piece of information as important. "Your name is Keiko Park?" Mrs. Carter asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Yes." "You were taken from your home in 1937? "Yes, from a village outside Pyongyang." "Do you remember the names of your family members?" Keiko recited them, names she had not spoken aloud in years. Park Min-ho, her father. Park Sun-hai, her mother. Park Dae-young, her younger brother. Saying their names made them real again, and the realness was almost unbearable. Mrs. Carter wrote everything down carefully. "We will do our best to locate them," she said. "I can't make promises about what we'll find, but we will try." "Thank you," Keiko said, and meant it. The Americans continued to surprise her. They held classes in basic English, taught by soldiers who volunteered their off-duty hours. They organized activities, simple things like group sewing circles or gardening projects, ways for the women to occupy their time and minds with something other than their pasts. They were patient when women flinched at sudden movements or couldn't sleep at night or broke down crying for no apparent reason. Captain Morrison made regular rounds of the camp, checking on conditions and asking if anyone needed anything. He was formal and respectful, always maintaining proper distance, treating the women as he might treat fellow soldiers or civilians under his protection. Once, Keiko overheard him arguing with a superior officer who had suggested the women be moved more quickly, processed more efficiently. "They're not cargo," Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They're survivors of systematic abuse. They'll move when they're ready to move, and will provide support for as long as they need it." The superior officer had backed down. Not all of the Americans were comfortable with the situation. Some of the soldiers clearly didn't know how to act around the women, avoided looking directly at them, or seemed angry, though the anger wasn't directed at the women themselves but at what had been done to them. Keiko understood. Sometimes bearing witness to horror was its own trauma. 3 weeks after their liberation, word came back about Fumiko's family. They had been located in a small town in northern Japan. Arrangements were made for her transport. The night before she left, Fumiko sat with the others in their tent and spoke for the first time about what she would say to her family, how she would explain where she had been. "I don't know if I can tell them," she admitted. The shame is not yours," Keiko said firmly. "The shame belongs to the men who built those places, who staffed them, who used them. You survived. There is no shame in survival." Fumiko looked at her with wet eyes. "Do you believe that?" "I'm trying to," Keiko said. When Fumiko left the next morning, she hugged each of the women, held on tight as if memorizing the feel of people who understood. Then she climbed into a jeep with her few possessions and was driven away. Keiko watched until the vehicle disappeared, feeling a complex mixture of happiness for Fumiko and envy that her own news had not come. More weeks passed. Summer gave way to early autumn. The camp population shifted as women were reunited with families or transferred to other facilities. New arrivals came in, discovered by patrols or relief workers, each with their own stories of survival. The Americans treated them all the same, with careful respect and determined assistance. Keiko's English improved. She learned phrases like, "Thank you," and "Good morning," and "I am fine." That last one was a lie more often than not, but it was a polite lie, the kind that helped people get through their days. She helped translate for newer arrivals, using her Japanese and limited Korean to bridge gaps. It gave her purpose, something beyond simply existing. On an overcast day in October, Mrs. Carter called Keiko to the administrative tent. Keiko's heart raced as she walked across the camp. This was either news about her family or some other matter. She couldn't decide which she feared more. Mrs. Carter's face was carefully neutral when Keiko entered, which told her nothing. "Please sit down." Keiko sat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We've located your brother," Mrs. Carter said gently. "Park Dae-young. He's in Seoul, working for the provisional government." Keiko's breath caught. "My brother. He's alive." Not a question. A confirmation of something too large to process immediately. "Yes, he was 15 when you were taken. He's 23 now." 23. Dae-young had been just a boy, all knobby knees and gap-toothed grin. Now he was a man older than she was when she'd been taken. Time had passed differently for him. He had been allowed to grow up. "My parents." Mrs. Carter's expression shifted, became even more gentle. "I'm sorry. Your father died in 1940. Your mother died last year. Your brother has confirmed it." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything. Dead. Both dead. She had known it was possible, even probable. So many had died during the occupation, during the war. But knowing something intellectually was different from having it confirmed. "How?" she asked. "Your father was killed during a labor conscription. Your mother died of illness," your brother said. He didn't have details. Keiko nodded slowly. Her parents were gone. She would never see them again. Never apologize for not being able to resist when the soldiers came. Never explain what had happened to her. Perhaps that was a mercy. Perhaps they had died still believing she might come home someday. Still holding hope. That was better than knowing the truth. "Your brother has asked that you be sent to Seoul as soon as you're ready to travel," Mrs. Carter continued. "He says he has a place for you to stay, and he wants to see you. He knows where I was, what I was. He knows you're alive and coming home. What you tell him beyond that is your choice." Keiko looked down at her hands. They were cleaner than they'd been in years, the nails no longer broken and torn. But they still shook sometimes, especially at night. "When can I leave?" "Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow, next week, next month. There's no rush." Keiko considered. Part of her wanted to leave immediately, to see her brother, to begin whatever came next. Another part wanted to stay here forever, in this liminal space where she was neither the girl she'd been nor the woman she might become, where the Americans fed her and asked nothing in return. But staying was not living. It was just another kind of prison, albeit a gentler one. 3 days, she said. "I need 3 days to prepare." Mrs. Carter nodded. 3 days. "We'll make the arrangements." The news spread quickly through the camp. That evening, the women threw an impromptu gathering for Keiko. There was no alcohol, but someone had convinced the cooks to make rice cakes, and the Americans provided extra rations of fruit. It was modest, but it felt significant, this acknowledgement that one of them was moving forward, reclaiming life. Hannah gave her a handkerchief she had embroidered with small flowers during the sewing circle. "Something to remember us by," she said. "I won't forget," Keiko promised. How could she? These women had been there in the darkest moments. They understood in ways no one else could. Even Captain Morrison appeared briefly, offering formal congratulations and best wishes. "You've been through hell," he said through George Yamada's translation. "I hope you find peace on the other side of it." "Thank you," Keiko said. Then, in halting English, "You are good man. All Americans here, good men. We not forget." Morrison's face reddened slightly. "We just did what anyone should do." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. The world was full of people who didn't do what they should. These Americans had chosen differently. On the morning of her departure, Keiko dressed in new clothes, civilian clothes provided by the Red Cross. A simple dress, stockings, proper shoes. She packed her few possessions in a small bag. The embroidered handkerchief, some spare clothes, vitamins the doctors had insisted she continue taking. Everything she owned fit in one bag. She had started with less. The Jeep was waiting. George Yamada would drive her to Seoul personally. A journey of several hours. Other women came out to say goodbye. Some cried. Some hugged her tightly. All of them looked at her with something like hope, as if her departure proved that moving forward was possible. Keiko climbed into the Jeep and looked back at the camp one last time. It had been temporary, a way station between horror and whatever came next. But it had also been important. It had been the place where American soldiers had proven that kindness was possible even in war, that humanity could survive even after the worst inhumanity. The Jeep pulled away, and Keiko watched the camp recede, much as she had watched the comfort station disappear months ago. But this time, she was moving toward something rather than simply away. That made all the difference. The drive to Seoul took them through countryside recovering from war. Buildings stood damaged but not destroyed. Fields were being replanted. People moved along roads carrying goods to market, rebuilding their lives one day at a time. Korea was scarred but alive, and perhaps she could be too. George Yamada didn't talk much during the drive, for which Keiko was grateful. She needed the silence to think, to prepare. What would she say to Dae-young? How did you summarize 8 years of suffering? How did you explain that the sister he remembered was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who had learned to endure the unendurable? They reached Seoul in late afternoon. The city bore the marks of war and occupation, buildings damaged by bombing, infrastructure struggling to recover. But it was also alive with activity, people determined to rebuild, to create something new from the ruins of the old. George drove to an address Mrs. Carter had provided, a modest house in a district that had survived relatively intact. He parked the Jeep and helped Keiko with her bag. "Would you like me to come in with you?" he asked. Keiko considered, then shook her head. "This I must do alone. I understand. Good luck, Mississippi Park." "Thank you for everything." George nodded, climbed back into the Jeep, and drove away. Keiko stood on the street, bag in hand, looking at the house. Somewhere inside was her brother. She took a deep breath, walked to the door, and knocked. Footsteps inside. The door opened and a man stood there. He was tall, taller than her father had been, with serious eyes and her mother's nose. He wore simple clothes and held himself with quiet dignity. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. "Keiko?" he said, his voice breaking slightly on her name. "Dae-young." Then he pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly, and she felt him shake with suppressed sobs. She stood rigid at first, unused to being touched without violence or violation. But slowly, carefully, she raised her arms and hugged him back. Her little brother. Not so little anymore. "I thought you were dead," he whispered. "For years, I thought you were dead." "Sometimes I was," she said. "But I'm alive now." He pulled back, looked at her face, and she saw him notice the changes, the age in her eyes, the hardness around her mouth. He didn't ask what had happened. Perhaps he could guess. Perhaps Mrs. Carter had told him. Perhaps it didn't matter because she was here, alive, and that was enough. "Come inside," he said. "I've made food. It's not much, but it's home." Home. The word felt foreign. But she followed him inside anyway, into the small house that smelled of cooking rice and clean tatami. There was a low table set with dishes, a pot of soup steaming in the center. Simple food, but prepared with care. They sat, and Dae-young served her, filling her bowl, offering her chopsticks. Keiko looked down at the food, at the normalcy of it, and felt that same painful crack in her chest that she'd felt when the American soldier first gave her water. This was what life could be. Simple, peaceful, kind. "Tell me about yourself," she said. "What you've been doing. How you survived." So he talked and she listened. He spoke of hiding from conscription, of working underground to resist the occupation, of the joy and terror of liberation, of their parents' deaths and his grief. He spoke of finding work with the provisional government, of believing in Korea's future, of keeping their parents' memory alive. When he finished, he looked at her expectantly. She knew he wanted to hear her story, but she couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I'm not ready to talk about it," she said quietly. "Maybe someday, but not now." Dae-Jung nodded. "When you're ready. Or never if that's what you need. You're home now. That's what matters." Home. There was that word again. Keiko looked around the small house, at her brother's earnest face, at the bowl of soup cooling in front of her. Was this home? Could anywhere be home after what she'd experienced? She didn't know, but she picked up her chopsticks and began to eat, and that felt like a start. The soup was good, warm, and nourishing. Outside, the sounds of Seoul filtered through the walls, the city alive and rebuilding. Inside, Keiko sat with her brother and ate, and for the first time in 8 years, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe, possibly, eventually, she might be able to live again rather than simply survive. It wouldn't be easy. The nightmares would come. The memories would surface at unexpected moments. The shame and trauma would take years to process, if they ever fully could be. But she had survived. She had endured. And now, thanks to American soldiers who had chosen mercy over cruelty, she had been given a chance at something more. That evening, after the meal, Keiko stood at the window and looked out at the darkening city. Somewhere out there were other women like her, survivors making their way home or trying to build new lives from scattered pieces. Some would make it, some wouldn't, but they had all been seen by those American soldiers, acknowledged as human beings worthy of care and respect, and that moment, that unexpected kindness, had changed everything. Historians would debate it later, whether these encounters were policy or isolated incidents, whether the Americans had truly understood what they were doing or simply responded instinctively to horror. But for Keiko and the others, the debate was irrelevant. What mattered was the moment itself. The moment when soldiers lowered their weapons and offered food instead. The moment when they treated brutalized women as people deserving dignity. The moment when, in the midst of war's cruelty, humanity had broken through. That moment would live in Keiko's memory forever. Both the horror of what came before and the unexpected relief of what came after. It was the pivot point, the instant when survival became possible, when the future opened up from a single dark path to multiple possibilities. She didn't know what those possibilities would bring. She didn't know if she could ever fully heal, if the scars would ever fade, if she could ever trust men again or feel safe in her own skin. But she knew that she would try, because trying was what you did when you survived. You kept moving forward, one small step at a time, holding on to the moments of kindness that reminded you why survival mattered. Behind her, Dae-Jung was clearing dishes, humming softly to himself. The sound was ordinary, domestic, peaceful. Keiko closed her eyes and listened to it, letting the normalcy wash over her. This was what those American soldiers had given her. Not just physical freedom, but the possibility of ordinary moments. The possibility of standing at a window in her brother's house and listening to him hum while doing dishes. The possibility of something beyond endurance. It was enough. For now, it was enough. She turned from the window and went to help her brother with the dishes, and together they cleaned up the remnants of the meal, working in companionable silence. Two survivors finding their way forward in a world slowly healing from war's wounds.